Okay. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. I think we should go to India and let's stay here in Ontario and do a little organic farming, shall we? Let's see how that kind of combination works out. I have two guests today who haven't met until just now. Jill Carr Harris is in India. She's at an ashram some distance south of Delhi. There for the funeral, I guess, of a mentor or some spiritual leader that her husband reveres. In Ontario, I presume, on his farm, is Tony McQuail, my very favorite organic farmer in the whole world, because I think you're the only one I know. So it's easy to be my favorite. Hi, Tony. How are you?
Hi, Maida. I'm fine.
Great to see you again. Yeah. Well, are you on your farm?
Yes, I don't know if I can do this, but I don't think
Yeah.
you can look out the window. Well, maybe you can look out
Oh,
the
I can
window
see a
there and
little bit.
see
Yeah.
a pond and
There's a
green
pond. Hmm.
grass, and
Hmm.
that's our solar collectors that are sequestering carbon as we speak, as they photosynthesize and take carbon out of the air and put it into the soil where it'll do us all some good.
Wonderful. You're
So we're
wasting electricity. Is that it? You collect all that solar that you don't need and you just throw it in the ground.
Well, we enrich the soil with it so that it'll hold flood waters, and so that it'll also, if we have a drought, have better water retention, so that we're helping to also mitigate the dangers and risks of climate change at the same time that we're improving soil structure and also hopefully creating more nutrient dense food for people. So
That
there are a
is
whole lot
absolutely,
of things in play here.
oh my goodness. I have never heard anybody say that before. That you can use solar collectors and put the
Well,
carbon in the soil. And that
well,
does the same thing as plants do?
Maida, my solar collectors are those green plants out there. I do also have photovoltaic cells, but the solar collectors I'm using have been around for over 1 billion years and are a real proven technology, very low cost, don't require any special energy or technology to produce them. And if we manage them with an ecological or regenerative agriculture approach, they could be, I think, the lowest cost, lowest hanging fruit in the climate mitigation change, but it means changing how we manage and do in agriculture. We've industrialized it in a way that makes it an energy consumer rather than an energy producer, and that's just one of the problems in our overall society and how we've structured things. Um, but that's what I was trying to say. If you look at that green stuff out there in November, our fields are still collecting sunlight, collecting carbon dioxide and putting it down into the roots and into the soil. And
Okay, well, it does seem to be, I've heard of that process. It's called photosynthesis, right?
yeah, been around for quite a while, pretty proven technology.
Okay, but what surprised me was when I got the idea that you had panels out there that would collect carbon and put it in the ground, and I thought, oh wow, that's new. No, you
Yeah,
don't need those.
but that would be an extremely expensive way to do it, because you would have to build the solar collectors. Now, we do have solar collectors, and they produce electricity, which runs a little pump, which runs our irrigation and livestock water system. And we have a couple solar panels that, on balance, produce more electricity over the course of the year than our farm and our two residences on the property consume. So we do use photovoltaic panels, but we use them to produce electricity to offset nuclear or fossil generated electricity. So
I wanted to jump
that's
in, Tony, and say that in
sure, Jill.
India, we're noticing a lot more natural farming, zero budget farming, agroecology. I mean, it's quite astounding. Wherever you go, there's not so much in where there's really irrigation for cash crops, but in all the rain-fed areas of India, people are converting. I was with some people the other day who are actually getting indigenous cotton seed to grow, indigenous cotton to spin and weave cotton by hand, and to give products that are completely handmade from indigenous seed. And so this is becoming more and more common. So what we're starting to do is we're trying to, because this is India and because we have this tradition of Gandhi and nonviolence, we don't only look at sustainability, but we're looking at whether we're actually, we're seeing an emergent economy that is parallel to the mainstream economy. And, we're trying to give it narrative and definition in ways that we've never done before. So we're calling it, just for the sake of it, nonviolent economy, because we all come from a Gandhian kind of root or background. But it's just, I'm so happy to hear what you're doing, but this is becoming more and more common in India as well. And it gives us hope.
That is thrilling.
To me, it is one of the most hopeful signs, is this shift and a recognition that we have an incredibly violent economy, and industrial agriculture has been an incredibly violent approach to food production. Absolutely. And I mean, I wish I'd taken photographs of them, but like 25, 30 years ago, the herbicide advertisements in the newspaper had paratroopers landing in your field or a tank running over your field. So you're going to beat the weeds, you're going to win the war with the weeds. And this whole mentality has been, it's been destructive of communities, because the basic premise is you had to get bigger or get out, which created a form of social agricultural cannibalism where you tried to eat your neighbor rather than work with them. Then it was incredibly destructive of the broader ecosystem on which agriculture depends. And to me, there's a very hopeful aspect to this. And we've been involved in developing an organization called the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario. And it has grown in ways that's been very hopeful and exciting. And across Canada now, there's a group of farm groups and farmers working together called Farmers for Climate Solutions, who are promoting the regenerative or I like the nonviolent agriculture concept as well, as a way of addressing it. But, once we do it in agriculture, I think we also have to recognize that we have to do it across the whole economy. And that's where developing the links between food producers and consumers that create that alternate economy. The other thing that I wanted to raise and just put out as an idea is, we've got COP26 going on right now. And there's all this talk about high-tech ways of taking carbon out of the atmosphere, and we've got to electrify everything. But what if the problem is that we don't? We're using too much energy. Switching to electrifying everything is the problem. Is that we're already using way too much energy in the Western developed countries per person. Switching to electricity isn't some magical thing that just happens. It takes a whole infrastructure to produce it and distribute it. So to me, the big issue is the concept of redesign in our economy. How do we redesign what we're doing so that you can walk to work, and the energy you need to get to work isn't something you pump into a tank and then move a couple thousand pounds of metal, plastic, and rubber before you can do anything. Walk to work, and then the meal that you ate today, which was hopefully produced by a regenerative agriculture system, is how you get to work and how you actually do most of the things that society needs to get done. It's not a very
biogas.
But human nutrition, if we could redesign our economy so that we structured things so that we spun that cotton, didn't have as much stuff, but the stuff we had lasted longer and didn't contribute to the destruction of our children and our grandchildren, maybe it would be a more peaceful world.
Right, absolutely. I wanted to say, Tony, that Meta, on my way back from Canada to India, where I live, I stopped in Europe, and I was in Lyon. In the middle of France is Lyon. And I found it was one of those transition towns you know, that suddenly bicycle paths have replaced roads, community gardens are all over. They're integrating the suburban non-white people into recycling. You know, there's regenerative forests going on in traditional parks, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's about 8 or 10 transition parameters that you can find. And I just found it so inspiring. And I now realize there's quite a few municipalities that are taking this on. And so when I came back to India, I was trying to begin to talk to friends about this. And what then we realized is that our transition economy is in the villages, that lots of transition, because 60% of the people live in the villages. And so much transition has been going on. And in fact, it's based on thousands of years of how people anyway did it. You know, we tend to think that all the traditional knowledge systems are in the hands of Indigenous communities, First Nations, but actually most of the global South lived on, you know, with no pesticides, no fertilizer, rain-fed agriculture, growing food crops for the community. And it's just how we've managed to destroy that. But what is still left in South India is still a lot of great examples. So these are not just new, Tony, these are actually hereditary examples that were built up also after independence. And so we're trying to, you know, sort of say, look, if this has worked for so long for people like, you know, why can't this alternative economy feed everybody? Why do you need to give us this other narrative that this is not sufficient to fulfill basic needs? So I think where I wanted to just conclude, Tony, was to say we need an entire narrative that is not just saying Tony has an organic farm and Mr. X has organic shop and so on, but we need to see it as an economy with horizontal linkages where, you know, production, distribution, exchange, and trade, marketing are seeing many different goods, both agro goods, but also handicrafts and other kinds of things. But that's not to say we shouldn't have some outside economy. It's just that we have to build up from local resources. I just wanted to remember for you that we have this group called Swadeshi in southern India and Kerala that produces 300 products, Tony, from traditional resources. So they make soap from everything they have around them. They make, you know, 300 products. I have the products in this catalog right here. And it's just amazing how our imagination doesn't go that way, because the narrative is you have to go to Walmart, you know, and only Walmart produces products.
Well, part of that narrative is progress, and we think that everything new is somehow better. But I mean, my ancestors were not using pesticides 100 years ago, and you know they weren't driving cars 120 years ago. We've got this whole industrial, technological infrastructure that didn't exist. And that doesn't to say that everything was wonderful, but our ancestors survived, and we're here because they survived overall. And I'm not sure we're giving that same chance to our potential descendants with the structure that we've built. So that's the challenge. And the other thing that's I see as a challenge is that the stories of the things you're talking about, the stories of the things I'm talking about, are not yet being mainstreamed in a way that people have a hopeful narrative. The narrative right now for young people is incredibly unhopeful and distressing. And when people don't see someplace where they can put hope, that's a problem. I've got a timer going off because I have to put some bread in the oven. So I will keep my headset on. You two be the beautiful visuals in this thing for a while, and I'll be back very shortly. I think I can. I think I'll be able to participate.
Right. Well, let me take this opportunity to leap in and pretend to be Doug Saunders, because Doug would be with us and may in fact join us, but I don't think so. He's in Germany now, and he told me he had some project he had to do, and he will join us if he can, but I don't know. Anyway, last time you and Doug were on the show together, you had quite a conversation, Jill, about Indian farming. And I felt very ambivalent, and I left with more questions than I had at the outset, actually. But I know that Doug has maintained his position, which is that Indian farming is kind of not very well developed and is not adequate, in that he says that the land and the climate are such that it would be possible to raise 3 crops a year in most of those farms, but that only 1 crop is being produced. And it is being produced with what he would call antiquated methods. I think he would like to see more modern technology. Now, I have a lot of other friends who are, whether or not they call themselves organic farmers, are certainly all concerned about the fact that this so-called modern farming technology that we've been using is destructive and is ruining the soil, and we only have X number of future crops before it's all depleted. So we have to do something better. And whether or not what that looks like, I don't know. But one of the things that I want to ask is about the productivity of organic farming, or the kind of farming that you're saying is taking hold in these communities in India that you've been watching, changing over to newer methods, or some maybe old methods. I don't know. You're saying partly both, I think. And I did a conversation, a talk show a couple of weeks ago with a professor at Guelph University, an agriculture professor who is a great enthusiast for and big promoter for organic farming. And his name is Ralph Martin. It's possible that Tony may even know him because you're both into organic farming. And now one of the things that he said stuck in my mind. He spends a lot of his attention on trying to get people to stop wasting so much food. He says that something like 40% of the food in Canada is actually wasted, never consumed by people, and much of it would have been just fine food. So he says that, if I'm not misquoting him, and I think I'm right, that the farming technology, organic farming, is probably healthier for the consumer, and certainly better for the environment, but you don't get as much food produced as you would with high-tech farming. And but he says you get a little less food, and I don't know what percentage, what the ratio is, organic to standard techniques of farming. But he said the way to make up for that is, if we would stop wasting so much food, we could do the organic farming, and that would be ample. And I'm perfectly prepared to accept that argument, except that what I've been told, and I think we have to take it seriously, is that the population is increasing so much that we actually have to substantially increase the amount of food that will be produced as we get up to 9 billion and possibly even 10 billion people before the world's population begins to turn around. I guess my question now, having wandered around the subject or not, is whether or not these better, ecologically superior, and often old-fashioned, but certainly carbon sequestering methods of farming that you're advocating can produce enough food for this expanded population. If we begin to waste less food? And then the question is how much could you reduce the amount of wastage anyway? There are a whole bunch of questions in that, and I'll let you unpack it and try to give me your answers. Tony, what do you think?
Well, Maida, I think first you have to ask, how do you measure productivity? Because much of the modern industrial food system is really about converting fossil fuels into food through the synthetic fertilizers, the pesticides, the fuels in the vehicles. I attended a conference in Italy, Terra Madre, a number of years ago, and was raising the idea of using draft animals as part of the equation in agriculture. And one of the other people spoke up and say, well, yeah, like 30,000 farmers in Europe and North America use tractors and high-tech equipment. 300,000 are using draft animals. And most of the world's food producers, if you go by a per head food producers, maybe a million, are using their own personal labor to hoe the ground, to plant the seed, to look after the crop management. So we have this huge divide in terms of.
I want to know, did you say 30,000 are using tractors, et cetera, and 300?
That's what the person said, and I think that may just be a relative thing. I wouldn't quote it.
Well, I'm sorry, but I haven't seen anybody, traveling around Europe or North America. I haven't seen anybody using a draft animal in ages.
Well, you have to come visit us. But
what do you use?
The point I'm trying to make before we leave that, because I agree, I think those numbers, I'm not putting those numbers out as accurate. But the point is, we have Europe and North America highly industrialized, and certainly parts of the rest of the world have adopted that equipment and technology. But that's really about turning a very short-term resource in terms of its long-term availability, which is fossil fuels, into the work that gets the food produced. And in many cases, the pesticides which are used and the fertilizers which are used to supposedly create that large volume. So Maida, if you look on an energy in, energy out, which is something I did look at 40 years ago when I was at university in environmental studies and looking at agriculture, modern agriculture uses about 10 calories of energy to produce 1 calorie of food. And that is a very unsustainable system. And I am fairly confident in that. The figures I've seen over the decades have indicated that we're looking at 10 calories of food or 10 calories of energy to produce 1 calorie of food. Those primitive pre-industrial systems used 1 calorie of energy to produce between 5 and 50 calories of food. So those primitive systems were very efficient at collecting sunlight and using limited amounts of human or animal energy to do that conversion. And so our modern industrial system is only productive if you look at the output per person. And if you only count the person on the farm and not the person working in the pesticide industry, working in the fertilizer factory, working at John Deere in the implement manufacturing thing, and the person driving the truck between those manufacturing sites and the farm dealership, which sells this stuff to the farmer, and the truck that delivers it to the farmer, and the truck that takes it from the farmer down to the stockyards or the elevator, and then the processing and all the stuff that goes before it hits the grocery store, and then the car getting it and taking it home. So we have a very inefficient system that is also a planet destroying system, if we look at it from that perspective. So but the second thing I'd like to say is, if there's a penalty in terms of production per acre from a long-term regenerative agricultural perspective, it's extremely small. The long-term studies that have compared it and then have compared the performance during drought years and flood years have found that ecologically managed or regeneratively managed land tends to do much better under those stressor situations, and that in the long-term average, the yields are not wildly different. during the transition, if you've had a farm that's been addicted to fertilizers and dependent on pesticides, then during that transition period, there can be quite a yield penalty. But once you get the system operating on a biological rather than a chemical dependent approach, the differences in productivity are not as great. And so those would be my thoughts.
Can you give me a number? Like what's the ratio?
Oh, I think it'd be the Rodale. You'd be talking at maybe a 5% penalty. And maybe, and certainly in drought years in that benefit. And that's, I suspect, Jill, why people in your part of the world are making the switch is because the expenses of the industrial system are much greater. So the risk carried by the farmer is much greater. And as you move into less reliable weather patterns and climate stuff, the risk that farmers take on by trying to manage everything and control everything with pesticides and fertilizers and expensive equipment become harder and harder. The other thing is that in small scale diversified ecological things, people can multi-crop, multi-layer things and get far more productivity per acre than you can with big equipment that doesn't lend itself to selectively harvesting something in the understory and then selective harvesting something that's right in an overstory. And so the studies that I've seen that look at productivity on a land base say that, effectively managed small scale production will outproduce in terms of energy and food yield on a per acre basis, highly intensive chemically and equipment dependent agriculture. Okay, so I think that the starving population, that we're going to starve the population if we don't stay on our current trend. Well, we're going to destroy the planet if we stay on our current trend, and COP26 doesn't turn things around pretty quickly. I came of age during the Arab oil embargo, when oil was not available at the pumps. And it made me realize just how vulnerable the system is.
Yeah, I mean, I come from a totally different angle there, Tony and Meta, which is I'm looking from, the women in the community. And they're not really looking at, large farms and growth and yield. See, there's been so much male out migration that now women are largely becoming the farmers in many parts of India. And what they're interested in on their little plots of land, because many of them have like 1/10 of an acre or half an acre or 2 acres, average 2 to 3 acres. On this, they're looking at basically healthy food for their children. I mean, ideally, if they, the problem with industrial agriculture is it's created very unhealthy food. It's lowered all good food. It's also monocropped. It's taken away the traditional millets and all of the traditional rices and wheats that were so vital to people's diet. The level of diabetes has shot up in India because people are eating basically white hybrid rice 3 times a day. The second thing is soil is depleting like anything. So what you're having also in these climate shifts, these huge flash floods, landslides, because the soil is not absorbing water, so it's rushing over the top of soil and creating havoc and damage. I'm in an area that is semi-desert here. And in August of this year, there were floods that were so big that they, were about 3 feet high, the water, was left about 3 feet high, drove away all people's houses, crops, lost animals. They've got to regenerate soil. The soil has to absorb water. Then, of course, in this part of the world, there is the overuse of water in industrial agriculture, plus the lowering of groundwater. And surface and groundwater need to reach, surface recharges groundwater, but you find groundwater 300 feet under the earth here, right where I am, whereas 10 years ago, it was 50 feet. So I think the mining of water is another major issue. So there's a basket, there's a whole set of interlocking issues which are forcing people to rethink how to manage. It's not just being ecological refugees. And where I disagree with Doug Saunders there, Mita, is that the government is bending in favor of large industrial agriculture based on the sense they're saying, oh, we cannot fragment land and have all these small pieces. It has to be consolidated. We have to be able to use tractors and everything that Tony just said. That is the model that has come from the West. That is what creates our big corporate agricultural entities, which is what is pushing the government on these three agricultural policies. It's not entirely, there is some benefit from these three agricultural, they're laws, actually proposed laws, that the government wants to bring in effect for, there's some benefit to some middle class farmers, but for the most part, it's adverse. And that is why we still have farmers on strike here. Tony, they've been on strike for 1 year and must be coming up to 2 years now. They've been on strike for a long period of time. They're still sitting there. They will continue to sit there for another 2 years until the national election, because and these are largely middle class farmers from Haryana and Punjab, but they've got the solidarity of farmers across this country, and they are not supporting the Modi government's agricultural policies. So, part of it, of course, is that the Modi government decided these policies with a parliament that was not really functioning, decided it. And, it's one thing to decide a law when you're affecting a small group of people, but when it's 600 million people who are going to be affected, that is you have to be very careful. And Ambani, Adani, these big Jindal, these are the big guys that are taking thousands and thousands of acres of land when we had a land ceiling in this country that said no more than 40 acres for one farmer. And they're into thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres because they've manipulated these laws in their favor. So, when you have 1.3 billion people, 60% of which depend on agriculture, you cannot have a few corporates running agriculture. But in a way, I think it's going to turn agriculture eventually around. We'll have two parallel systems. We'll have some industrial agriculture by these big corporate houses, what we call corporate farming. And then we'll have more and more of the small and medium farmers going for natural farming.
About 50% of the food in the world that is consumed today exists because of fertilizers. Now, if that's the case, then organic farming couldn't really hold up. One of the questions that I invited Ralph Martin to address was whether or not it would be possible to get along with use organic farming and still produce as much food.
Maida,
Yeah.
it's important to recognize the difference between synthetically manufactured fertilizers and fertilizers in the form of compost or animal manures or vegetable wastes. So there's a whole potential different stream, and also there's atmospheric nitrogen. Plants don't just remove carbon dioxide from the air, they can also source nitrogen from the air if you have a well thought out crop rotation or crop. It's a question of how you design the system and how you deal with materials flow. How much of the fertility that we eat ends up being flushed out into the rivers and the ocean in the form of sewage waste that properly managed and properly composted could be a nutrient stream for agriculture. We've created these systems that are linear and flow stuff through rather than cycle stuff. And nature is a great cycler of resources. Energy flows through the system, but materials cycle. And one organism's waste is another organism's feedstock. And we have a very poorly designed system if we're looking at trying to mimic nature and manage for minimal waste and effective energy use. And that's part of the problem with how we've designed things. But yeah, if you cut off all the conventional fertilizer tomorrow, it would be very disruptive. But if you redesign the crop rotations and the cover crops and other stuff, you may discover that, in fact, you can increase the biological activity in the soil to free up a bunch of the mineral nutrients in ways that they're currently not being made available, and capture the nitrogen that's atmospheric and bring it into the equation so that you don't need. I mean, I haven't applied chemical fertilizer to my farm in 40 years, and my soil is richer. My plants are healthy. Actually, it's longer than that. I only used chemical fertilizer, I think, in the first 2 years, which was back in the 74, 75 crop years. And I did an experiment with some organic fertilizers that were more basic mineral stuff, and didn't see any big change between the areas where I applied it and the areas where I don't. So that I've got a very biologically active soil that is impressively productive in terms of both what's growing on it and what's living under it and what's living on it. We had an interesting experience many years ago. We had a CBC television crew out here because they'd gone to some place who had genetically modified potatoes, and they wanted to see some organic potatoes, and they saw our potatoes. But afterwards, their sound man took his sound boom and was just walking around our fields. And he said, "I've never heard so much insect sound. It's just amazing." But it wasn't that we had an infestation of pests. It's that we had a balance of life out there. So yeah, there's some pests, but mostly it was beneficial stuff, pollinators and predatory insects and parasitic insects, all buzzing and humming out there. And so you can create an agriculture that celebrates life, not just the food value that we intake as human beings, but the whole system that supports. And I'm so excited, Jill, to hear that's happening in India. It's happening here, not on a huge scale yet, because the same forces that you're talking about creating the legal framework to disenfranchise and dispossess Indian farmers to get huge land holdings is also playing its role here in Canada and in the United States, so that government policies and government regulations tend to favor the get big or get out mantra that was started 50 years ago. And that has been a concentrator of wealth, not in the hands of farmers, but in the hands of the input suppliers and in the commodity dealers. But it's the National Farmers Union, which we're members of, has shown that the income level for farmers has been really static during this time and has either been negative or a little bit positive. But the income and the share of the consumer food dollar that goes to the corporations has just gone up and up and up and up. But that's the result of government policy, not efficiency of those agricultural systems.
My heart is with you. And I'm trying to represent the alternative point of view as well as I can. So let's take the thing that troubled me, and the reason I asked Ralph Martin to come on was I wanted to ask him how to get along with less or no chemical fertilizers. And I mentioned something. There's an organization called BioPivot, I believe, or Pivot Bio, I can't remember which, in California, Berkeley, I believe, where they have a new technology that will enable them to get along with no or less nitrogen fertilizers. And we're not talking organic farmers now, but regular ones. And the idea is this, that in the soil, there are bacteria that produce nitrogen. But they have sensors that determine whether there's plenty of nitrogen, whatever they mean by plenty, already there, or whether there's a shortage. And when there's a deficiency of nitrogen, they produce it. So these sensors are the things that these guys are working on. They turn off the sensors that enable them, these bacteria, to detect the presence or absence of nitrogen, so that these bacteria will simply keep on producing it indefinitely and not turn off. So the reason for adding nitrogen fertilizer is apparently it occurs when the bacteria have said, okay, that's enough, we're stopping for now. And the farmer says, no, we need more. So they get more and put it on. But what these folks are going to be doing is coating, first of all, they coat the seeds with this, whatever this chemical is that enables it to turn off the sensors in the bacteria in the soil, so that the bacteria will keep on producing more and more nitrogen as long as they want it to. And if that's not enough, they'll come back later and squirt a little bit more in the soil around the plants. So this will then enable the soil to keep on acquiring more and more nitrogen. But of course, fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, consist not only of nitrogen, but also of potassium and phosphorus, I believe, as well as some micronutrients. And what I wanted to know was whether or not you'd still have to add some of these alternative types of fertilizers, unless you happen to be Tony McQuail and would not touch the stuff with a barge pole anyway. So that's, actually what Ralph Martin said is he wouldn't go near the stuff because he's afraid that if you put something in the soil that just keeps on producing nitrogen, you'd have a surplus or even a poisonous condition in the soil where the nitrogen would be excessive and dangerous. So I'm setting up an appointment to talk to these biopivot people and ask them these questions. But maybe I should have you along to ask them questions too. But I can see you really want to get hold of this mic and answer me. So go for it, fella.
Well, I guess what I'm asking, is this going to be the nitrogen cancer of the soil? One of our challenges is we're in a society that doesn't know how to say enough. And now we've got these little nitrogen fixing bacteria, Azotobacter probably, that say, hey, soil, you've got enough to have a balanced nutrition for the plants that we've been working on for over 1 billion years. One of the problems that Jill's mentioned is the declining nutrient value of food as you bulk it up by increasing the nitrogen and the phosphorus and the potash without having a corresponding increase with all the micronutrient elements and all sorts of bio elements in there as well. So I'm not at all sure that I would jump on the bandwagon of turning off the sensors that let the microbes say, well, there's enough nitrogen out there, we don't need to produce as much. That's part of the reason that chemical fertilizers are so destructive to the biology, is they do turn off the natural biological nutrient cycling and availability creating microbial interactions with the root hairs and the root exudates that the plants are sending out to get the nutrients they need to keep a balanced growth and a balanced nutrient-rich fruit or seed or stalk. So I would be very anxious and skeptical of something that says, well, this is the whole replacement philosophy. Well, we'll replace fossil fuels with electrical vehicles. We'll replace synthetic nitrogen by creating a flood of nitrogen by turning off sensors in the bacteria. That isn't what the root problem is. The root problem is we have systems that are out of balance. Well, the root problem is we have been, for the last number of years, we've been destroying the biological structure of the soil and the biological interactions of plants. We're discovering now, and there's a lot of exciting stuff going on in soil science on the symbiotic relationships between plants and soil microbiology and plants in themselves, that the root systems of plants interconnect and actually will share nutrients It's why a more biologically diverse or species diverse crop will actually do better in a drought, because the plants aren't competing so much as cooperating. Since Darwin, we've had this idea that competition is the thing that makes everything work better. Well, if you look at nature, yeah, there's some competition, and yeah, the old and the weak get eaten by the predators, but there's a lot of cooperation out there. And in the plant soil interface, there's a lot more symbiosis than we ever realized. And there's a lot more beneficial microbes than root parasites and disease things out there. So again, trying to figure out how to work with nature so that we get a bit of the surplus and the system has enough to maintain itself.
Here's the problem. There are two problems. I'm trying to look at both sides of the equation because I think it is a dilemma. If half of the world's food comes from fertilizer, then there's no way we can just turn off the fertilizer and do without it. On the other hand, the fertilizer itself, you haven't even mentioned this downside of the fertilizer, which is that it runs off into the lakes and eutrophication takes place. Yeah. It then runs into the ocean and it's poisoning the ocean. And I even saw some people say that it could actually produce I'm going way beyond evidence now, but an extinction event by producing hydrogen sulfide when it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. That's a far off. Let's not even work on that at the moment. But it is damaging the oceans anyway, whether or not it can produce some increased fish and so on, but it has some bad effects. So I'm looking at both. We've got to have the fertilizer and we can't afford to have the fertilizer. And then you've given me all kinds of other reasons. Now, I just want to know how well we can actually do without fertilizer and yet increase the amount of food that produced that's healthy, enough to feed the 10 billion people that may be here before we turn this curve around, because it could hit 10 billion. So I'm looking for alternatives. I'm really looking for alternatives, and if you can convince me that organic farming is going to be able to handle not just keeping us even with the amount that we're producing now, but actually increase the amount of food that is going to be produced for the increasing population, I'll be your friend for sure.
I was looking for a book, and it's by Gabe Brown, and it's called Dirt to Soil.
I have it on my iPad.
Okay, well, I encourage you to read it if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. Because I think,
by the way, I've tried to get him to let me interview him on my talk show, but he doesn't want to do it. He said, well, if you do it while I'm driving my pickup truck, okay. But no, I couldn't do it that way.
He's a busy guy and much in demand because he was a conventional farmer who after 3 years of being whacked by bad weather, was about to lose his farm and go bankrupt, and made the transition to a much more natural farming, and has found it very successful and a lot more satisfying and a lot more productive. Unless the food is there, you're not going to reach 10 million or 10 billion or 12 billion or whatever. I mean, without food, people don't exist. So I think the issues...
Policy recommendation, let's stop producing food so we can curb this population bomb.
Oh, that would certainly do it. Or, nature may come back with us with some variants of COVID that are much more effective at dealing with the parasite that the planet's got on it right now, which is us. And that won't be a happy time for anybody. But I guess the hopeful thing of the COVID experience is when we're faced with something we think is life-threatening, we can make big changes, at least in some places. And to me, climate change and our energy misuse are two much more life-threatening things that are combined than COVID has been. But we aren't making the kind of transition and choices that would get us out of there. But back to your question, I think issues of land tenure and government policy are much more significant in terms of people being able to feed themselves and have a stable enough personal economy that they can stop overproducing more children than they need to support them, because too many will die under the kind of conditions they're living under. So until we deal with a more equitable distribution of resources around the world, so that the poor aren't desperately having children because either they don't have contraception or they don't have any kind of sense of long-term security for themselves and their kids. And we've got the food to do that now. We've certainly got the resources. If I just heard the figure that the U.S. spends $8 billion on Halloween garbage, most of which is plastic crap that'll end up in the dump. I mean, if we've got that kind of money to celebrate Halloween, maybe the UNICEF boxes ought to get all of that and it go for effective development.
So, Tony, I want to step in here because I've been working for 30 years on land rights and getting poor people pieces of land. And I can tell you that what astonished me so much when I went to villages for the first time is I found 30% of a village in India average is landless. That means they're working on someone else's land. Maybe they can lease some land. But so then we began to fight for the land because we realized those people can't eat. They can't eat because they don't have land and they have to do wage labor. And, we've seen that wage labor has its limitations. In COVID, when all these factories closed, we saw wage laborers walking thousands of miles to get back to their kilometers to get back to their villages. It's an unsustainable way. And, it's much, it'll be more economical for the country as a whole to help promote land redistribution. And in India, people say, well, there's no land, but I tell you, there's land. Because how is it that one guy can get 80,000 acres to grow food if there's no land? How can, cities expand and so on? It's a question of how you plan the use of the land or who regulates land rights. So I'm with you. I think the bottom line in terms of handling population and handling things is, first of all, to get land distribution, land tenure, allow people to eat, basic things. We have found that on 1/10 of an acre, you can have kitchen gardens that feeds the family for a certain portion of the year. So India is amazing with population technologies because of such a large population on such a young landmass. We need to learn how creative these strategies have been for managing that. But I do agree with you that when there's security, there is more planning and less children and so on.
I want to ask you about Jean Drèze, because Jean Drèze is a friend of mine, but he's always too busy to talk to me because he was running this thing called the Right to Food, or the Right to something like that. And there was a big campaign to get the government of India to acknowledge that every human being has at least a right to basic survival food. And that seemed to have been a pretty successful thing. Now, as I understand it, a few months ago, there was an election, I believe, in Kerala. He is the new minister of something or other, probably agriculture. I don't know whether you're in touch with him or not, but I would, certainly his campaign on the basis of the landless peasants has been his preoccupation for the last 25 or 30 years. And I wonder if you know what policies he and the other people in Kerala are trying to put forward about land redistribution.
I do. I mean, Kerala is a very, very overpopulated place. And the land, we're fighting for land rights in Kerala right now. And most of the land distribution is going to Dalits, very, very small household plots. So the land distribution happened in Kerala in the 70s. In the highlands, people in the lowlands, mainly Christian population, moved up and took the highlands. In fact, they pushed the indigenous people off their lands also. Recently, I don't think there's been any major land redistribution in Kerala. We have a home there, we live there, we work on the land issue there, and that's not my knowledge. But there have been places where there is, in India, where there has been some land redistribution, like Madhya Pradesh, where I am now, in central India. A certain amount of land redistribution has been going on. As for Jean Drèze, his work on food security was amazing. There was a Right to Food campaign. It ran mainly from 2000 to 2010. And it slowed down because of a variety of factors. Mainly, the Congress went out, which was favorable to those policies, and a new government came in, the Modi government in 2014, that was not favorable. But I think, food, we're now really talking about food sovereignty. Food security is something that is safeguarded by the state in terms of fair price shops, trying to collect food to sell at low price to poor people. But food sovereignty is more what Tony is talking about, where land and an agroecological system is feeding people and they have more self-reliance. We should not be depending only on government's 1 rupee rice and so on, because that is not sustainable. Also, there's a lot of corrupt practice behind that. So really, you want to build self-reliance among people. If people have land, can grow their own food, and have some food sovereignty, they can make the government more accountable in all of their policies. If they're waiting for government handouts through fair price shops, they can't make the government accountable because they're waiting for their benefits. So this is why food sovereignty is a much better option than food security. Mm-hmm. But I know Jean Drèze agrees with that premise as well.
Okay, that's great news.
I'd encourage anybody who does tune in at some point to visit efao.ca. They have a conference coming up. It'll be a digital one, and it'll be talking about regenerative agriculture in many ways, and to do some research on it, particularly if you're a farmer. But the other thing is, you have a choice 2 or 3 times a day. Every time you choose to eat something, is this food that is being grown in a way that helps regenerate the soil, rebuild local community, and help deal with climate change? Or is it something that is expropriating people and sending nutrients off into the oceans and sending carbon up into the atmosphere and part of the problem? So we each have a choice, whether you're a farmer or whether you're an eater. There's a choice there. And if we're going to have a future for our kids and our grandkids, we need to start making those choices very consciously and very ethically.
Yeah, I see. I'm much more aware nowadays of the value of guilt. You've just guilted me. Oh, and no, you should. Everybody should guilt everybody else when it's appropriate. So thank you for making me aware of my obligations morally to be mindful.
I think, but don't eat out of guilt. It's an opportunity to eat nutritious, tasty food that connects you back to a productive past and a hopeful future. And to me, I don't think guilt moves people as much as hope and joy. And good food and sharing it with people, which COVID makes it much harder to do. But sharing good food with other people is one of the most joyful things human beings have done for millennia.
Indeed. Thank you both. It's been fun and productive and a real constructive, joyful experience. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Maida.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Nice to meet you, Jill.
Thank you.